when I was about 19 I met this guy who worked at the subway near where I worked. He was a nice enough guy and he took me out on a date. Everything started off really well, but about a week into it he started asking me for money. It started off small at first, like for a soda or $5 for gas. Then he started asking for larger amounts, like a few hundred to get him by for a week or so. I never gave it to him, but he started wanting to move in together within about 2 weeks of dating. When we would go out places he started to do very weird things. He would start screaming in public or singing nonsense at the top of his lungs. He would always play around afterward that he was just having fun, but it was weird and embarrassing to be seen with him. Also, my dog who loves everyone would not let him near me. I've never seen that dog so much as growl at another person, but he would try and bite the shit out of him when he came close to me. By the end of the second week I broke up with him over the phone. I normally didn't do that, but at the time his erratic behavior made me nervous. He completely flipped the fuck out. He started showing up where I worked to the point where my manager had to ban him from the building and coworkers walked me to my car. He would show up literally everywhere I was, even to the grocery store or the gas station. I started getting text messages and weird email about how we were meant to be and he couldn't live without me and such. Then one day he showed up in the middle of the night and told me to come outside. I told him to leave or I was going to the cops. He literally started sobbing to the point where he was almost hyperventilating. I went back inside and locked the house up. The next day I was home alone and just doing some work. At the time I was in college, when I heard some rustling by the front door. I thought it was just the dog messing around or the mailman or something, but the dog started barking and growling. The doorbell began to ring. I didn't think much of it, probably just a solicitor. Someone started messing with the door handle. I grabbed a broom of all things because that was all I had and I heard someone open the door. My dog tried to bite him and I locked myself in my bathroom and started screaming that I called the police. He up and ran away. I called my neighbor who lived across the street from me and was former military. He checked out the house and made sure he was gone. My dog had a few scrapes and cuts on him, but he was okay. I filed for a restraining order the next day and my dad took the liberty of calling his father and explaining what happened. I received a few other emails him following that, but he never came to my house again. Luckily, I've moved a few hours away and I'm married now, but it was still very frightening at the time considering this was only about a 3-week period. A few years ago, my anxiety was I was already at a point in my life where I thought I was a little out of it, but that was amplified by a lot when I kept repeatedly hearing noises outside my window. Like every single night, it just wouldn't stop. I would finally get so freaked out I'd go wake my parents up and get them to look outside, but they never found anything. I started to think I was crazy or just subconsciously seeking attention. One morning, my grandfather discovered one of our lawn chairs beneath our bathroom window. It's pretty high up and the bottom pane is fogged, so I'm not sure the chair even helped, but it was left there regardless. The next night, heard sounds again, nothing. The night after, however, we checked outside and discovered something that made my stomach churn. A small stepladder was sitting directly outside of my window, back just enough to allow someone to sit on it but still see. On my windowsill was a bag of now cold McDonald's, which is just up the street from me. Most of the food was still in there, but still, some fucker had been watching me doing absolutely nothing of interest in my room without me knowing for I don't know how fucking long. The cops were called, nothing happened. I felt crazier than ever. No one was to be found, but at least we had some evidence that someone that shouldn't be hovering around our house was at my window, watching intently through the blinds, in a space between the two curtains. Heard noises the next night. Ran outside, nothing. Earlier in the night I'd sewn my curtains together, which hopefully made it harder to see in. Apparently it did, because now the fucker had taken to climbing on top of our air conditioning unit, and from there, climbing onto our Herbie/garbage can, then standing on that so that he could see above where the drapes went. The handprints and shoe prints were left on the lid to prove it. I should also mention that there were now holes in my screen, and I heard these holes be created. He took a stick and sharpened it somehow, we found it outside my window, and was trying to stealthily break away the screen bit by bit. The hole is still there. The next night, I distinctly heard the gravel near my window crunch. There was simply no mistaking my sound. As stealthily as I could, I let out a small moan he surely heard and rolled just out of view, as if I were sleeping, then pressed myself against a wall out of view of the window, very quietly opened my door, and crept down the hall. My heart was pounding. Normally I knock on my parents' door, but I knew the slightest sound would make the bastard bolt, so I quietly opened their door and sneaked in, then informed them that there was, without a single doubt, someone outside my window. They didn't mind the intrusion and got up, got dressed, formulated a plan, and crept to the back door. I ran to the bathroom to stand on the edge of our tub and peek out the window just as the back door was thrown open and my parents ran outside. And sure enough, they saw him. They started screaming as the man leapt off of the Herbie and bolted down our driveway, which was what I was looking at. They screamed all sorts of horrible things at the tops of their lungs. "You sick motherfucker, I'm gonna fucking kill you," from my dad. "You fucking freak," from my mom. He ended up escaping across the street, hiding behind a house adjacent to us. The balls on this bastard, he kept peeking out at us as we all stood outside, but we wanted to leave him there so the cops could finally nab him. They were called, they came, and they searched, but they never found him. Bastard must have hopped a fence or some shit. Still to this day I hear sounds outside my window, even in the dead of winter, but he's never out there. He might have just been a peeper, but he targeted me specifically, and for months, until he... What really pisses me off is that once he lost interest in me because it was too unsafe, he moved on to a house down the street, with 2 little girls. He actually managed to get in through their window, and their dad caught him just standing in the middle of the room, watching them sleep, jacking it, I think. I still don't think he was caught, even then. All I know is that it could have been way worse, but it messed me up. I trust the men in my neighborhood even less now. The men around here stare very blatantly. I've been chased home by one. I've had a guy try to jerk me into his car when I was passing him, telling him no, I didn't need a ride, and to leave me alone. All these years later I still hear shit outside my window and freak out. It's fucked up. I turn out my lights, entirely, to exercise. I do my best to avoid the windows when I undress. It just scarred me, even though it wasn't a huge deal. Peeper fucked up my sense of safety, targeted me for months, was almost caught, then left me alone, we think. Then moved on to a house with 2 little girls. I am a male 26 years of age and currently am in this situation as I type this. I have been our domestic house manager's target for close to a year now. She has been stalking me in vain. I don't know what I possess that she sees in me. I have tried to give my parents signals to understand what's going on, like how the cartoon Courage the Cowardly Dog does it, but in vain. In 2020 I ceased to sit and eat with them on the dinner table because the house manager had a habit of letting out gossip of what I was doing during the day, who I talked to, etc. It was just late last year that I decided to carry my cell phone everywhere I move around the house and discreetly record the events at the time. One time she was recorded her saying how she took and disposed one of my mum's favorite pet cat. I sent the brief footage to both my mum and cousin. I am glad I saw those red flags that no one else is able to see. She isn't getting in my feelings this. My advice is first know that the person is actually stalking you, pay attention to the repeated stalking patterns, then immediately try to collect as much evidence as you can. Your phone is a great tool, but you can also use audio recorder if the stalker is loudmouth. And also make sure you talk to someone you would trust and confide in. 3 years ago, it was the beginning of August, and I was 3 months into my brand new job when I left work, walked through the empty parking structure with my taser tucked inside the sleeve of my jacket, my eyes darting toward every dark nook and cranny. It was somewhere around 1 a.m. and the parking lot was deserted, which made every hair on my body stand on end. My phone was in my pocket, with my best friend on the line, listening for a scream. I clutched my keys in my other hand. The second I saw my car, I sped up, tugging on the door just as a habit before I went to unlock it. Before I could do that, however, the door opened in my hand. I cocked my head, sure I'd locked it. No, wait. I wasn't sure. I was positive. I knew for a fact I'd locked the doors, because I knew what happened to stupid little girls when they didn't lock the doors. Still, a part of me wondered if, maybe, just maybe this once, I'd forgotten. I got in the car. Shut the door behind me. Hit the lock button. Told my best friend I was safe in my car. Hung up. Lather, rinse, repeat. It was only after I'd started to put my key in the ignition that I froze. I'm a pretty short girl, so it only took a moment to realize that the seat was pushed back much farther than I ever would have pushed it. I looked around, my eyes sweeping the interior. Although there wasn't anything jarringly obvious, something was off. Brushing past my unease, I turned the key in the ignition. All around me are familiar faces. I jumped, my hand flying to my mouth, as music blasted from my stereo. The wipers scraped. All my dashboard settings had been changed, the time set 4 hours and 14 minutes into the future. All my radio stations, except for the 4th station that I was currently listening to, had been changed to static. He's here. I spun around, half expecting to see a darkly dressed figure sitting in the back seat. No one was there, of course. But the blanket I'd had strung across the seat was now perfectly folded, and on top of that rested a tiny silver box. Inside, there was the edge of a torn parking pass for the hotel I worked at. That's all. Just enough for me to know what it was, what it meant, but not enough for me to know who it belonged to. I checked the rest of my car, searched for any sign of tampering. At some point, I realized that my car hadn't been broken into. The doors had been unlocked, and they'd been able to turn my car on, but they hadn't hotwired the car. I could see that clearly. I called my dad. I need you to check and see if you still have my spare key, I said. Still half asleep, my dad grumbled, it's outside in the truck. My blood ran cold. My dad's truck, that had been sitting outside all day. My dad's truck, that he wouldn't have noticed someone breaking into because it was 20 years old and didn't have an alarm, like my new car. Please, I whispered, too scared to raise my voice. For once, he didn't argue. He went outside, he checked his car, and he told me what I already knew. My key wasn't there. In its place, however, he'd found a little bouncy ball, like the one you'd get from a quarter machine at the grocery store. He was in your car. My dad sounded horrified, but not surprised. We were never surprised anymore. Wait, my dad paused. What about your spare house key? Is it still there? No. I held my breath as I rummaged through my glove compartment. I nearly tore the whole thing apart, silent tears running down my face as I searched for something I knew. We'll change the locks, my dad promised. What he didn't say was again. I cried the whole time I drove home. My dad waited on the front porch for me, a gun tucked in the waistband of his pants. Inside, I barricaded myself in my room. I pushed my dresser in front of the door, took a blanket and sat in the corner of the room, with one of my dad's guns on the floor next to me and a knife in my hand. I stayed there until the sun came up, and I stayed there until my eyes were too dry to cry any more tears. I stayed there so long I wasn't even 100% sure I was awake anymore. I stared at the single bouncy ball on the floor in front of me, nudging it back and forth with the tip of my knife. The scariest experience I ever had in a forest was when I was about 12 years old. My parents owned about 6 acres of forest and 6 acres of garden, cleared area. One afternoon we had already picked all the garden veggies that we had to, and I was allowed to do what I wanted since we were all through with the work for the day. I proceeded to take a walk down into the forest. There was a clearing of some sort that my dad had made to drive down into the forest, but it could only be accessed by a 4-wheel drive since there were lots of little stumps and bushes. This forest was pretty much untouched woods. We had previously had to bury my little pet Chihuahua due to her getting very sick and passing away some weeks before this particular day, and I wanted to visit her grave. We had buried her way back at the very back of the property and made here a little grave that we could visit if we wanted to, and this was a pretty day, so I decided to go visit my little canine friend's grave, alone. I went all by myself. I stayed a few minutes and said few words and left. As I was starting my way back through the 6 acres of woods, not having any fear at all, I started feeling like I was being watched, a very strong sense that I was being observed by someone or something. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything that looked out of the ordinary. Actually, everything was eerily quiet. Something in my extrasensory part of my brain told me to run and run as fast as I could, or I may never make it out of those woods. I started to run, but I tried to just run normally and not make it look like I was panicking, but inside I was panicking. I kept turning and looking over my shoulder and didn't stop. I felt like I was being pursued, but at that point I just booked it out of there. Thankfully I made it to the clearing and safety of where my parents were. I knew I was safe then at that point. I started to think that maybe it had all been in my head and I overacted. I mean, I had been in those woods countless times exploring without any fear ever. Later on that evening we heard on the news that a dangerous escaped convict was on the loose. Can you guess where? He was in the woods where I was. That was where authorities had pinpointed him, and at the time I was in the very section of woods where he was. I am glad that I listened to my inner voice to run and not stop. Who knows if he would have hurt me or not, but I am very glad to know that God planted that in my brain. I believe that He talks to us. It may not be an audible voice that we can hear, but He does put thoughts in our minds. A group of 5 of us were walking in a big patch of woods behind my aunt's house when I was about 10. We used to like to go back there because back in the 80s, when I was a kid, parents would kick their kids out of the house for hours at a time. They'd say, "Go outside and play." My aunt was particularly mean about it. She would lock the door until she was ready to let us back in. We weren't supposed to go in the woods because the adults said it was dangerous, but we were kids and bored, so of course we went anyway. Well, this particular time, we went much further in than we normally did because we were bored with the area that was closest to the house. After a while, we came to this big clearing in the woods that was filled with furniture. There were couches and chairs all set up like a living room, and there was a trunk with clothing in it. Well, we thought that was just the coolest thing ever, so we all hang out there and pretended it was our house. After a little while of being there, we started hearing what sounded like someone walking around very close to the clearing. We got that eerie feeling that someone was out there watching us. We looked around and didn't see anyone, but we were spooked and decided to head back. Then we suddenly heard someone start whistling a tune, and it sounded like it was really close. Well, we freaked out and started running home. As we were running, we heard heavy footsteps gaining on us. At first they were walking, and then it sounded as if they were running to chase us. We were all terrified, screaming and crying. We burst out of the woods to my aunt's backyard and ran up and started frantically pounding on the door. It was still locked. We ran around the front, trying to get as far away from the woods as possible. My aunt wasn't answering the door and her car wasn't in the driveway. Now we were really terrified. Then suddenly from around the side of the house, my uncle jumped out and screamed, "Gotcha!" We all burst into tears. LOL. Apparently, they had tried to call us in a little while after we left, and when we weren't in the yard, my uncle went into the woods to look for us. He saw us from a distance sitting in the clearing and decided to mess with us. Needless to say, we never dared to go too far into the woods after that. I know my woods well. It's a large wood, with some parts deciduous and some parts pine. There are not usually many people in the woods, and if there are, it's at times like weekends in nice weather, and they tend to stay on the main paths. I walk there a lot with my dogs, and if I spot too many people, I can easily turn off and reroute to a deserted, hidden path. I know the main paths, and a good number of small side paths, like the back of my hand, though there is occasionally one I've not spotted before and will explore. I know my bearings pretty well, as the woods is generally on a slope. I know what's at the top and what's at the bottom of that slope. In the main part of the woods, the path layout is basically one main path all around the edge, and 5 paths coming off that at various points, converging in the middle of that large circle, in a pretty clearing, which has a map and a picnic table in it. There are other side paths, so if you know the layout of the other main paths, you usually have a good idea of roughly where you will emerge. There are other stretches of woods and more footpaths outside of that main ring, so the extent of woods overall is much further than this main area. As an idea of distance, you can walk fully around the outer ring path in about an hour, at a steady walk and chat pace. One evening, during the week, and heading into winter, my friend Gail and I took our dogs to the woods. We figured we had around 1.5 hours till it would get dark, plenty of time for a good walk. Our boys, the 2 Labradors Harry and Dennis, spend all of this time off the lead, sniffing around, chasing, jumping in puddles. They are generally like a couple of toddlers charged up on sweets, running around with sticks and poking stuff, exploring side paths but always coming back periodically to make sure that Mum is still nearby. Costa the Beagle has to stay on the lead, as the Beagle urge to follow her nose is just too strong, and she has been lost here before. So, Gail and I were strolling along, laughing at the boys and chatting. We were on a main path just off that central clearing within the outer ring path, when we spotted a new path that we'd not been on before. It was not particularly narrow or overgrown, it was a side path but a proper path. We decided to head down it and explore, which gave Harry the zoom eyes. He goes nuts when you take a new path. We all stood aside, and Dennis hid behind us, while Harry charged around like a nutter. More than one of us has been mown down before when Harry gets the zoom eyes, so we had to wait for him to calm down a bit. So, we went along this path. It was grassy underfoot, and in some places pretty muddy. There were logs crossing the path that we had to climb over. Being horsewomen, we rather thought it was like a cross-country track with a few nice log jumps thrown in, and indeed there were hoof prints along it. Well, this path was pretty winding but easy going. But then we realized that we had been walking on it for a good half hour, and by now the light was starting to fade. There had been no turn-offs on the path. There is no path within that outer ring that takes half an hour of easy walking, without emerging onto another path. But the path went on, and we were going across the slope, not up or down, so we should, in my head, have been hitting the outer path, by a long, high wall, after 15 to 20 minutes of taking the new path. This path went on, it was getting darker, and I was so sure of my bearings, yet there was no way this path could be so long. The feeling that we were lost was getting stronger, the night was closing in, and we were alone in the silent woods. At this point there was nothing we could do but keep going, because surely that would be quicker than going back. After nearly an hour, the path emerged onto a wider path, and we felt relief as we could then just head to that high wall, and down the path that followed it, back to our cars. We knew where we were again, but the dogs were blending into the shadows as the last of the light faded away. The creepy thing about this whole thing, was that my sense of direction was correct. We were heading in the direction of that big wall all along, and that's where we came out, but the path could not possibly have been so long. We were on it for an hour, yet that outer path around the edge of the woods took an hour all the way around. Here is a very rough map of the woods which I have drawn on the back of an envelope. I have since been back to my woods, those woods I know well. I have never been able to find that path again, despite looking for it. It should not have been hard to find, as it wasn't a narrow or hidden path and it had to be somewhere in the quadrant on the map, Quinn ran. I suppose we were engrossed in chatting when we took the path, and relieved to be somewhere familiar when we got off it, but I cannot for the life of me remember where the start or end of that path might be. The path seems to not exist anymore, and it was so long as to be impossibly long, knowing the area of the place that it had to fit within. "3 years ago, I went to Wales, Anglesey, and went for a walk in the woods nearby whilst my parents stayed in a little cottage overlooking the sea. I was walking through the woods when from a distance I encountered a very large dog, and the owners were sat on a little bench that was close to a tree. And the dog could see me, and I heard it start barking ferociously as soon as it saw me, and I could see it edging forwards towards me, so I panicked and turned around and ran as fast as I could and ended up getting completely lost. It was a big forest. Upon running, I got tangled up in a nettle bush and got cuts all over me. My dress had ripped as well as my tights, and I was in pain and bleeding. I couldn't get out of it, and I could still hear that loud deafening barking. The dog's barking seemed to be getting louder. But the dog never ended up finding me. At this point, I was crying. I was so scared. I barely ever go anywhere alone without the company of someone, so I was terrified. I ended up getting out of that nettle bush to be greeted by my dad heading up in my direction. I couldn't tell you how thrilled I was to see him coming towards me. He came looking for me as I'd been out for such a long time. Just a little FYI. I had a massive phobia of dogs back then. So it made it all the more scary to me. Even a tiny little chihuahua would make me scream. Now, I adore dogs, and they are absolutely everything to me. So if I was put in the same situation now, I don't think I'd have ran away. Although that dog was scary. It was some type of mastiff. It was huge, and it seemed like it was in protective mode, understandably. As he was probably just protecting his owners, he may have thought I was a threat. Another scary encounter, that happened in the exact same woods about a few days after that one carrot. There was a mausoleum in the middle of the woods too, and I decided to pay a visit to it, yet again on my own. It was getting a bit late, around 5 p.m., but it was early September, so it wasn't quite dark yet. And just from standing in front of it on my own with no one else around, just gave me the chills. I had a funny feeling from standing there. So, I didn't stick around. I quickly got myself out of there. XD, the atmosphere surrounding it was eerie. Made me feel on edge. I spent a week backpacking alone in the Grand Tetons last year. It was the day of my 20th birthday when I was about halfway through the trail, which means I was the farthest point into the backcountry and miles from any civilization. That day I hiked farther into the day than normal to cover as much distance as I could. This was a mistake, because when I reached the designated permit campsite areas most were already taken. I continued on the trail before I reached something that kind of resembled a campsite. It was a small dirt area under a tree that sat adjacent to a tiny stream. I was uneasy about the spot, but it was getting too dark to find another one. I set up my tent and fell asleep alone in my small two-person tent right as the sun went down. A couple hours later, I woke to the sound of a twig snapping. I thought it was a squirrel or a marmot, so in a sleepy daze I hit the side of the tent to scare it off. Then there was a sound like something hit back. It frightened me, but I decided it must have been a branch or something that fell from the tree. I was still exhausted at that point and went back to sleep. Not long after I was woken by more twigs breaking, but this time they were noticeably steps and loud ones at that. I knew I was in bear country, but it was pitch black and I had the rain cover on and couldn't see anything. I hoped it was a deer and that it would wander off, and the sounds did stop. For a while. About 30 minutes later the same cracking sounds of twigs on the ground were moving the other direction. That's when it stopped and sniffed my tent. It had thunderous breaths and there was no doubt in my mind now that it was a bear. I had nowhere to run and all I had to defend myself with was a pocket knife and a can of bear spray. So I stayed up the rest of the night wide awake with both in my hands ready to defend myself. It stayed around my tent for 5 terrifying hours, infrequently walking, sniffing, and, at one point, scratching at my tent. It wasn't until the sun came up and the sound stopped that I had the courage to bolt out of my tent and as far away as I could get. When I looked back there was no sign of a bear, but when I finally returned to my campsite there were massive paw prints in the dirt surround it. It was the most terrifying night of my life.